So cerebrum, gross features or external features. As you can see in this diagram on the right side, we have two cerebral hemispheres on either side of the midline, separated from each other by a longitudinal cerebral fissure. This fissure contains the dipping fold of dura mater, which is called the falx cerebri, as well as some vessels called anterior cerebral arteries. So this longitudinal cerebral fissure is dividing the cerebrum into two hemispheres, right and left cerebral hemispheres. Now each of these hemispheres, as you can see in the diagram in this picture on the right side, they are showing the surface of each cerebral hemisphere is showing different folds separated from each other by the presence of fissures. The folds are called the gyri. The fissures separating these gyri from each other are called sulci. Single is gyrus and sulcus. Plural is gyri and sulci. And secondly, surfaces of each cerebral hemisphere are three in number. The largest of them is labeled as supralateral surface of each cerebral hemisphere that basically begins from the superior and medial supromedial margin of each cerebral hemisphere and continues downward and laterally. So this surface is called supralateral surface. When you will separate the cerebral hemispheres from each other in the midline with the help of longitudinal cerebral fissure, you will basically reveal the inner line facing the medial surface, medial line, the surface called medial surface. This surface shows maximum number of gross features on it. And then when you will turn the cerebrum upside down, you will see the base of the cerebrum, also called inferior surface or the basal surface of the cerebrum. So these are the three surfaces of cerebral hemispheres. With the help of central, parietooccipital, lateral, and calcarine sulci, we divide each cerebral hemisphere into at least 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. So let's first discuss briefly about the sulci that are helping us to divide the cerebral hemisphere, each cerebral hemisphere, into at least 4 lobes. So starting with the central sulcus. Central sulcus is the largest sulcus in length, and it is the most visible sulcus on the surface of the cerebral hemisphere to the naked eye. So this sulcus begins along the supromedial margin of each cerebral hemisphere, runs downward and laterally. So the lobe that lies anterior to the sulcus is called frontal lobe. The lobe that lies behind the central sulcus is labeled as parietal lobe. And further down and behind to the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe. So next we have, after the central sulcus, that is basically dividing the superior and lateral surface of each cerebral hemisphere into an anterior frontal lobe, and posterior to the central sulcus is the posterior lobe, and further posterior to it we have the occipital lobe. And on the side and inferiorly to the supralateral surface, we have the temporal lobe, separated from the frontal and parietal by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So what is parietooccipital sulcus? From where does it start and where does it end? It begins for a very small distance on the superolateral surface, but it is most visible on the posteromedial aspect of the medial surface. This entire shown here is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, one cerebral hemisphere. So here in the dark yellow, you can see the parietooccipital sulcus, which is going downward and anteriorly to meet the calcarine sulcus at right angles to each other. So in between the calcarine sulcus and the parietooccipital sulcus lies the third lobe of the cerebral hemisphere called occipital lobe. So what have we done so far? Central sulcus, parietooccipital sulcus, and the calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus is also more visible on the almost posterior and medial surface of the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And it is shown at its upper end being uniting with the parietooccipital sulcus at the right angles, then going downward and posteriorly. Both of these sulci, they are more visible on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Then we have the last sulcus, which we have here as the lateral sulcus. So here we have the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus has one stem, right? Has one stem that begins on the, here you can see on the inferior surface is the stem of the lateral sulcus. It begins on the inferior surface of the cerebrum, right? And then it moves and ascends towards the supralateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, where it divides into at least 3 rami. The anteriormost ramus, which is horizontal or transverse in position, is called the anterior horizontal ramus. Next to it is the other ramus that is seen to be ascending over the supralateral surface, and this ramus is called anterior ascending ramus. Then the last ramus left, that is shown to be running posteriorly between the temporal lobe and frontal and parietal lobes. This ramus of the lateral sulcus is called posterior ramus. So what are the gross features and what sulci and gyri are present on the lobes of different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere? Starting with the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe, here you can see in the diagram shown in the yellow, it lies anterior to the central sulcus. So the gyrus that is present just anterior to the central gyrus is labeled as precentral gyrus, meaning precentral meaning in front of the central gyrus, central sulcus. And then this gyrus, next to it is the sulcus that is called the precentral sulcus. So that means precentral gyrus lies between 2 sulci, behind central sulcus and anteriorly precentral sulcus. From the precentral sulcus extend 2 further sulci. The superior frontal sulcus, here you can see, and the inferior frontal sulcus, dividing the anterior aspect of the frontal lobe into at least 3 gyri. So in between these 2 sulci lie 3 gyri. So here we have the superior gyrus that lies above the superior frontal gyrus, sulcus, and then the middle gyrus lies between these 2 sulci, And then we have the inferior frontal gyrus that lies inferior to the inferior frontal sulcus. So two sulci enclosing or dividing the frontal lobe into three gyri: superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. So next we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is the one that lies just immediately behind the central sulcus. So here you can see in the diagram on the left side of the slide, here we have the central sulcus. So the gyrus that immediately lies posterior or behind to the central sulcus is called post-central gyrus. Next to it is the sulcus. Further posterior or behind to this gyrus, that is the post-central gyrus, we have another sulcus called the intraparietal sulcus. So from the post-central sulcus, another sulcus extends within the parietal lobe of one cerebral hemisphere that is called the intraparietal sulcus. So why is it called intraparietal? Intraparietal matlab it is within the parietal lobe of one cerebral hemisphere. And it is basically dividing the same parietal lobe of the same cerebral hemisphere into two lobules. So the part of the parietal lobe lying above or superior to the or medial to the intraparietal sulcus is labeled as superior parietal lobule. And the one that lies inferior or below to the intraparietal sulcus laterally is labeled as the inferior parietal lobule. So here we have the temporal lobe. This temporal lobe lies below the lateral sulcus, which is separating it above from the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. This lobe is divided with the help of two gyri into, with the help of two sulci into three gyri. The sulcus, which is above which lies the superior temporal sulcus, is labeled as superior. Above which lies the superior temporal gyrus is labeled as here superior temporal sulcus. And the gyrus that lies between the superior temporal sulcus above and inferior temporal sulcus below, shown here in this purple color, this gyrus is called middle temporal gyrus. So the one gyrus that is left is the inferior temporal gyrus, and this one is lying below the inferior temporal sulcus. So here in the yellow is shown the inferior temporal gyrus.